to meet you.
What's your name? Kathy, what's your name? Cockenboy. Please to meet you. How old am I? Too old?
Far from home, Australian Air Force personnel are quizzed by children from a small village in the heart of Central Asia.
My name? Trent. Trent.
They're making this goodwill visit to a school just down the road from their air base near the city of Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan.
Начальник австралийской части, которая сейчас находится на аэробазе в Манасу. Over to you, sir.
The Australians know very little about the country in which they've suddenly found themselves, a country beset by economic hardship and its own political turmoil. Bearing gifts, they're trying to make things a little brighter for these kids at least.
Thank you. You're welcome. No problems.
The general population, I think, show a lot of support to the coalition here. Obviously, it's been a broad and big decision by Kyrgyzstan to accept the large number of forces that have come here to fight the war against terrorism.
Manas Airport was once one of the loneliest airports in the former Soviet Union, serving Kyrgyzstan's capital, Bishkek. It used to receive just a couple of flights a day. Now it's heaving with Western military hardware. At the edge of the airport, relics of Kyrgyzstan's air fleet have been pushed onto the grass to make space for coalition jets. To fly to Afghanistan from here takes less than an hour. This airbase is a vital asset in the American-led war on terrorism, but it's also a welcome bonus for cash-strapped Kyrgyzstan.
My understanding is that the money that the base has injected into the local economy is moving up to around about the 35 million US mark, which I'm told is around 3% of the GDP of Kyrgyzstan. So the input is significant.
This man is the main beneficiary of the US and Australian presence. Askar Akayev, Kyrgyzstan's president for the past 12 years. America's war on terror has come at just the right time for Akayev. He's using his new alliance with the world's only superpower to prop up his deeply unpopular regime.
На некоторые вещи можно закрыть глаза. Да, я с вами согласен. Но когда приезжает очень высокопоставленный военный чиновник Соединенных Штатов, в частности генерал Томми Фрэнкс, я встречался с ним, задал ему вопрос, что вы дали карт-бланш в действии президента Акаева, нарушение демократических принципов. Он говорил, нет, наши принципы остаются незыблемыми. Но это на словах.
According to Akayev's detractors, the president and his family have squandered Kyrgyzstan's economic windfall for their personal gain.
Действительно, его очень близкие родственники, особенно зять. Зять – это муж его дочери. Они практически весь бизнес в Кыргызстане контролируют. Сахарная отрасль полностью контролируется, нефтяная отрасль полностью контролируется, алкогольная отрасль полностью контролируется. То есть все прибыльные места, все прибыльные предприятия контролируются исключительно семьей президента.
Господином Джорджем Бушем.
We just finished our meeting with President George Bush.
President Akayev now has important new friends in Washington. but many are angered by America's double standards.
America is the country who proclaimed democracy and who stands for democracy all over the world. And now here they support Akayev, who is a real dictator, who tortures thousands of his people.
Сплоченные вокруг коммунистической партии трудящиеся советского Киргизстана, как и всей нашей великой Родины, голосовали за ленинскую политику партии.
For much of the 20th century, Kyrgyzstan was hidden from the world. Deep within the Soviet Union, it was dominated by its communist masters.
Поздно вечером стали известны результаты тайного голосования, которые прошли в два этапа.
In 1990, a presidential election administered from Moscow propelled an obscure candidate into Kyrgyzstan's top job.
Совершенно неожиданно для большинства партийных функционеров и других деятелей, привыкших видеть себя в коридорах власти, первым президентом Кыргызской ССР стал Аскар Акаев, фигура совершенно новая на политическом небосклоне республики, ученый-физик.
As head of the Kyrgyz Academy of Science, Akayev was an unusual candidate. His election surprised many, except for the communist power brokers who put him there.
И вы знаете, все коммунисты голосовали за него, потому что в конечном счете должна победить демократия.
In the tumultuous year that followed his election, the Soviet Union collapsed and Akayev found himself leader of a new independent republic. Last month, the president staged an extravaganza to celebrate 11 years of independence. He was quick to lay claim to some remarkable achievements.
Мы заложили фундамент новой экономической формации. Мы закладывали основы для развития демократии в нашей стране.
In fact, little has changed in the last 11 years. Akayev's Kyrgyzstan remains bitterly poor and far from democratic. This celebration is little more than an attempt to mask the failure of his leadership and his regime.
What we were looking at is a decade of, of decline in Kyrgyzstan. Certainly, industry declined dramatically and is still on the decline. The foreign debt of the country is continuing to rise. The poverty levels are continuing to rise. And of course, there are endemic health problems in the country as well.
And I'm very, very grateful that he's had the time.
Chedomir Flego is running a democracy summer camp for Kyrgyz teenagers. In 10 years, he's worked in many of the world's hotspots on projects aimed at stabilising fragile new democracies.
Why are Americans aren't able to come to help us?
When Chedomir first arrived in Kyrgyzstan, he was appalled by its entrenched political corruption.
I arrived in March 2000 at the time of the parliamentary elections, and at that time there were many problems, including street protests and demonstrations, and some force being used by the militia. Kyrgyzstan failed to meet international standards of holding elections. So what we saw was the traditional customs and the traditional attitudes of manipulating elections were in fact the dominating features of those elections.
Президент сейчас единоличный хозяин. Он сосредоточил в своих руках всю полноту власти. Все полномочия только в руках президента. Я считаю, что это неправильно, абсолютно неправильно.
Adahan Madomarov is a member of Kyrgyzstan's national parliament and one of the only opposition politicians who hasn't yet been muzzled by President Akayev. But he knows the risks of speaking out.
они боятся. Народ Кыргызстана боится говорить правду, потому что у него зять где-то работает, у него отец где-то работает, мать где-то, жена где-то работает. Потом будет очень большие проблемы. Вот, пожалуйста, вам демократия Акаевской. Когда мы, группа депутатов, пытаемся организовать встречу, местные государственные власти и Белый дом очень сильно препятствуют этому. То есть народ пугает, народ разгоняет, не дает возможности с нами встречаться. Это права депутата. Вот так нарушается. А простых граждан говорить нечего. Если у тебя деньги есть в кармане, ты прав. Если ты заплатишь, ты прав. Если нет у тебя таких возможностей, ты не прав.
Just across the road behind me here is the Kyrgyz National Security Service. Under Soviet rule, it was the local headquarters of the KGB. Downstairs in the basement is a torture room with an electric chair and several high-security cells. This is where President Akayev keeps his political prisoners. Akayev's highest profile political prisoner is Felix Kulov. Kulov was once one of Akayev's most trusted advisors. A KGB general, Felix Kulov was for a time the Minister of National Security and also served as the mayor of Bishkek. But in 1999 he suddenly cut his ties with the president, declaring Akayev's administration corrupt and undemocratic. Kulov then launched his own bid for the presidency. Within months, Kulov was thrown into prison and charged with corruption.
My brother, Felix, is a leader by his nature. I think that President Akayev is jealous about it. And he thinks, or he thought, that sooner or later my brother Felix would take his place.
After his sentence was read out, Felix Kulov spoke to his friends and supporters.
Еще раз прошу успокойся. Я хотел вам сказать, что это впервые в истории, начиная с 1937 года, чтобы приговор был подписан, отпечатан за 3 часа. Такого в истории еще не было. Свыше 80 листов. Больше 80. Нарушена тайна совещательных листов. Этот приговор заведомо неправосудный и недействительный.
Felix Kulov's supporters could hardly believe their eyes when their hero, the man they thought might one day be Kyrgyzstan's new president, was led away to his high-security cell. Dias Kulov and his wife Vera don't venture away from their country home very often these days. Since Felix's imprisonment, they've been living in fear. Some members of the Kulov family, including Felix's wife and daughter, live in exile in the United States. But Dias and Vera defiantly chose to stay and stand up to President Akayev.
He is a man who wants to enrich only his family, who lives only for his own sake. And we are ashamed of Akayev. We hate his smile, his cynical smile. I think he is an evil, and such a man couldn't be our president.
They might well be cheap thrills, and these rides are very old. But for most Kyrgyz people, this Soviet-era fun park is as good as it gets. In contrast, Kyrgyzstan's wealthy elite hang out at the top end of town. Here it's easy to spot Akayev's personal touch. His son controls this bank, while Akayev himself supervises the state gold mining company. But perhaps the most visible is his wife, Mayram Akayeva, who runs a string of salons selling imported Italian fashion, as well as a few expensive nightclubs. If President Akayev is disliked, then Mayram Akayeva is despised. Often the subject of rumour and street gossip, the president's wife is regarded by many as a manipulative woman who wields control over her husband and therefore Kyrgyzstan as well. It's no secret that she does in fact oversee many of Kyrgyzstan's top political appointments. High-ranking officials, including the imprisoned General Felix Kulov, complained bitterly about Madam Akayeva's interference.
Я по фактам говорю, 100% действительно сегодня президентом фактически является Mayram Дүйсеновна, не Askar Akayev. Она все решает.
Azimbek Beknazarov is a member of parliament and a vocal opponent of the president. He's highly critical of the excessive wealth and control wielded by Akayev's family.
За 12 лет он ничего не делал. Каждый день жизненный уровень населения падает вниз. Каждый день. Это экономика. А пограничный вопрос вообще не рассматривается.
President Akayev's high-handedness and dictatorial style has recently reached staggering new heights. Treating Kyrgyzstan like his own personal fiefdom, Akayev is giving away large swathes of Kyrgyz territory to neighbouring countries. It started with a few hectares Akayev handed to Kazakhstan. Now he's about to cede thousands of square kilometres to neighbouring China. In Kyrgyzstan's Tian Shan Mountains near the Chinese border, water thunders during the summer thaw. Mountains and water mean hydroelectricity, and Kyrgyzstan has plenty of both. But the president's willingness to give some of this precious mountain territory to China has touched a deep nerve.
Тенгри, Саржас и Земгукуш еще бедел. 4 месяца переходят к Китаю. Это народ не знает, депутаты не знают, мы не знаем, а по Конституции это решать должен Жогорка Кенеш. И вот этот вопрос все поднял, оказывается, тайное нарушение Конституции перешел в эту землю все около общего количества 140 тысяч квадратных километров перешел к китайской стороне.
Beknazarov was so incensed about the president's secret land deal with China that he called for Akayev's immediate resignation and impeachment. The criticism was all too much for the Kyrgyz president, and Beknazarov was thrown into prison.
Держали почти как-то секретно от всех внешних миров. И постоянно сами приходили какие-то люди, договариваться со мной, что я перестал критиковать Askar Akayev, что я не поднял пограничный вопрос.
The Fergana Valley in the south of the country is Kyrgyzstan's food basket. But this may be the next chunk of land to be handed to the neighbours. This lush valley is virtually surrounded by the Uzbek border, and Uzbekistan claims it as its own. There's also a large Uzbek population here, and ethnic tensions simmer beneath the surface. In violation of Kyrgyzstan's sovereignty, Uzbek border guards have recently started patrolling the Fergana Valley. Many are alarmed that Akayev has shown a willingness to discuss the land claims with Uzbekistan's President Karimov.
Каримов, президент Узбекистана, не признает просто нашего президента. Поэтому он односторонним порядком установил свою госграницу. Ответ. Ну, год прошел, я не смог получить ответ. И в этом году я поехал только вот оттуда пришел. Опять там до сих пор ходят патрули, останавливают кыргызские автомашины, людей, что хотят, то делают. Никому ничего не надо. Никому. Никто не защищает людей. Простых людей не защищает.
When you're, surrounded by Uzbekistan, China, and Kazakhstan, I mean, who are you to say anything on a regional arena in the voice of, 4 million people who have only water and gold to sell?
Philippe Nubel works for the International Crisis Group in Kyrgyzstan's southern capital of Osh, an ancient Silk Road city. He says that Kyrgyzstan's neighbours have long held designs on Kyrgyz territory, especially here in the south.
Because of border issues, Akayev becomes completely isolated, and then looking around, maybe he believes he has no other choice but to become this sort of like half dictator, half democratic face when speaking to the West. And I think the whole country is completely divided because also a lot of people do not actually see the benefits of democracy.
Earlier this year, public anger at Akayev's jailing of his opponents spilled onto the streets. In jail, Azimbek Beknazarov came under increasing pressure to recant.
Я сделал пресс-конференцию, там говорил, что я, ошибался. А я на пресс отказался. Нет, такого не будет. Я пока на своем уме. Аскар Акаевич сейчас забыл народ, он своим только.
The court case against Beknazarov, it seems to have incited the supporters of Beknazarov to the point where they started taking to the streets. And eventually, some of these street protests gathered force and momentum. And on one of those occasions, in fact on March the 17th of this year, a large group of of the supporters of Beknazarov marching to Kyrgyzstan were stopped from entering the town.
On this lonely road in southern Kyrgyzstan, a police cameraman recorded the unfolding drama.
This video had shown quite a long dialogue between the protesters and the militia, and eventually one of the figures of the authorities gave what appeared to be an audible order to advance to the military.
While those responsible for the bloodshed were being treated for minor wounds, the local morgue was receiving its first victims. Five people were shot dead by police, while a sixth was beaten to death shortly after the demonstration. Initially, the government blamed the protesters, claiming that they were dangerous and unruly. But the evidence, including this stolen copy of the police video, was overwhelming.
My understanding was that many copies of that video had been made and distributed around, at least around Bishkek, if not the country. And that video then caused a further stir and problem for the government, because then it was obvious to everybody that there was evidence available which contradicted the official position.
3200 солдатов переброшен Кирбен. Это просто не просто игрушка. Это же целая армия переброшена. БТР, оружие. Поэтому народ, кто считает, что основной виноват Akayev правильно.
The people were so angry they blocked the main road from north to south, from Bishkek to Osh. Fearing the disruption would grow, Akayev released Beknazarov from prison and eventually had several of the policemen involved in the shooting charged with manslaughter. While the deaths at Aksy demonstrated to the world the price of public dissent in Kyrgyzstan, the human suffering caused by Akayev's regime has been building for years. Even ordinary people who have opposed the president have soon discovered that Akayev's revenge is swift and often includes their relatives as well.
Мой брат работал в налоговой системе в Чолпаната. Ему просто сказали: твоя сестра оппозиционерка, и ты должен уйти с работы. То есть люди потеряли все родственники работу.
Tolikan Ismailova is one of Kyrgyzstan's best-known human rights activists, campaigning against the abuses of Akayev's government. In response, the government ran a smear campaign accusing her of corruption.
Потеряла маму, потому что она постоянно читала газеты, которые писали обо мне, но это может быть, это мое личное, конечно, но давление у нее было, и они просто не вынесли этого, очень большой прессы со стороны правительственных газет. Я потеряла маму, но до этого,
After her mother's death, Tolikan continued to take the government to task. She soon received another warning.
Я выходила из дома, за мной должен был выйти муж, и, рано утром, когда я выходила из подъезда, молодой человек сильно, ударил меня, я потеряла сознание, это было таким образом это сделано.
Meanwhile, back at Bishkek's Manas airport, the Akayev personal fortune is growing by the hour. The exclusive refuelling contract at the airport is owned by President Akayev's son-in-law. And with the US and Australia pouring millions into this place and aircraft taking off every other minute, the Akayevs are making a killing.
Опять-таки семейный бизнес. Там заправку делает исключительно зять президента. Там бизнес, элементарный бизнес.
С приходом, в аэропорт Манас американских войск и других, представителей из других демократических стран, мы думали, что с правами человека у нас улучшится, потому что без этого борьба с терроризмом, она слишком такая уязвимая. Бензин, который полностью,
обслуживает этот аэропорт, кто стоит? Опять же, зять Акаева.
Чувствовал, что на некоторые вещи можно.
Kyrgyzstan's political opposition is now asking whether the US can really be trusted.
Знаете, есть американский принцип: не бывает вечных друзей, есть вечные интересы. Там, где есть свои интересы, можно на демократические принципы иногда и обойти стороной. Об этом кыргызский народ сейчас тоже великолепно начал понимать.
Geçegi zaman barında gelip durgan tabında Kırgızdın geylen jigiti çok gözü kızarıp soyulup bıçak uzarıp çorulur tartkan köpürüm.
At the Bishkek Hippodrome, teams of horsemen from all over Central Asia are tussling violently over a goat carcass.
Aybek Fosa Rasvet komandasından Aybek, sol takımı baskan Aybek, durdup çıkan Aybek.
As Akayev watches on, just below stands one of his many Russian bodyguards. The briefcase he holds turns into an automatic rifle at the press of a button. More than a decade into his rule, public anger has reached new heights and the president is starting to feel the pinch. Many believe that Akayev knows himself that his days at the top are numbered.
Чем раньше он уйдет, тем лучше будет и для него, и для государства, и для народа, естественно. Чем раньше он уйдет. И чем раньше он уйдет, тем больше он может сохранить свой авторитет. Еще народ может простить. Нельзя довести страну до того, чтобы народ повсеместно начал выступать против власти. Нельзя до этого довести, нельзя этого делать.
Куда пойдет Кыргызстан? Это самый главный вопрос. Или он действительно станет подбрюшьем какой-то великой державы, которая будет обслуживать интересы и больше коррумпироваться? Или все-таки это будет такая независимая, нормальная страна с изумительными, замечательными людьми, которые мы сегодня имеем, именно построенная на ценности демократии и гражданских инициатив, и с подотчетным, хорошим правительством.